Hello and welcome to Season 3, Episode 30 of Logicast, the AWS News podcast brought to you by Logicata. I'm Karl Robinson, CEO and co-founder of Logicata, and I'm joined today, as always, by my ever-faithful colleague, lead cloud engineer, Jon Goodall. How are you doing today, Jon?
Oh, I'm okay. Can't complain. No amusing DIY stories this week, I'm afraid. So sorry, listeners.
Shame.
No.
The TAP saga has reached its logical conclusion. We need a new saga to entertain the listeners with.
Well, I might be moving offices, technically.
Ooh.
This might be the last Logicast out of the shed.
We don't need to update your place of work from an HR perspective, do we?
It's about 25 yards away.
I think we can probably get away with that then.
Building. It's the same premises.
Is it a different, what, 3 words location?
How big are they? They're what, 3 meters?
So like 3 meters square, so it could be.
By 3 it might be.
Yeah. But we don't keep that data on our employees. So yeah. But I'm curious. I'm curious, genuinely curious to know if it is a different what 3 words location.
I'll have to check.
Anyway, we digress. I need to introduce our special guest this week, Warren Parad, CTO of Authorus. How are you doing today, Warren?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on the show.
Great to have you on. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Warren, what you do for a living, what you do for the community.
Yeah, of course. So as you said, I'm the CTO of Authorus, run technology at our small SaaS company, which focuses on login and access control, primarily for SaaS and B2B. But I'm also a security specialist there, which is, I think, one of the reasons you picked me up for today's episode. And for the community, I'm a community builder. And unfortunately, that means I write a lot of things and I put them on my blog. So varied of topics. I think the most recent one I did was a long form article on how you should secure your secrets. So if you're interested in that, it's up and running now. But that's mostly where I spend my time, unfortunately.
Well, we'll be sure to include your blog link in the show notes for anyone who's listening, and they may want to check that out. And which category are you in the Community Builder program?
I think technically I'm serverless, but it's that plus security is where I spend, and some aspects on the databases that I spend a lot of time with.
Yeah. Is there a security category? Might be.
I think this year is the first year. Yeah, I think security is first time this year, actually.
Yeah. Are you a year one community builder? Or
I am. I sort of just went out on a whim and was like, oh, this is a thing I can try to apply. And I usually write like 3 to 4 articles per year. And so I had a huge backlog of things that I've done.
Nice. Well, welcome to Logicast, Warren. It's great to have you on.
So you can use this in your renewal.
Yeah, you can. You can put a link to this in your content reporting tool if you're one of the people who fills that in. And if you're not one of the people who fills that in, you should be, because I did actually win some swag in a random draw for people that filled in content on the content reporting tool.
Never 6 months out.
Yeah. Well, I'll have to know how many views this episode gets then.
We'll let you know. Yeah, we'll let you know. And we'll add a 0 to make it sound even more impressive. So,
well, thank you.
So, as regular listeners to the podcast will know, once a week I curate a list of AWS news, which I share via my weekly AWS News Roundup newsletter, which has done 201 editions now. I think I mentioned the big number last week, but it's even bigger this week. So, I might just keep mentioning it for a while until it kind of, then maybe when we get to 250 to 300. And those big anniversaries, I think it's worth celebrating. Anyway, once a week I curate this list of AWS news, and then Jon and I pick a subset of articles from the newsletter that we'd like to talk about with our guests. And Warren told me that his specialist area is serverless and security. So our first article this week talks about both of those things in a single article. So I think hopefully we're hitting the nail on the head here. And this is an article from the AWS Compute blog, all about strengthening data security in AWS Step Functions with a customer-managed AWS KMS key. So Jon, I know you're a big fan of Step Functions. Is this going to, rock your world?
I don't get it.
You don't get it. Okay.
I don't get it.
This is a first. This is a first for the podcast. Jon doesn't get something.
I understand what they're doing. What I don't get, and which is very much not first, what I don't get is why. Because as far as I can tell, they're encrypting the state machine itself. Fine. Okay. What's the point? What's the point? Unless you're building, and I guess you could in theory, large amounts of business logic into the step function, all of this lives behind the AWS closed door, very little of this is exposed to any sort of internet unless you kind of make it so in a Jean-Luc Picard kind of way. So whilst, yes, you can do this, and maybe you have an audit requirement that says absolutely everything ever must be encrypted, which is a bit kind of dense, really. It's one of those auditor has a checkbox, auditor doesn't get it. Is it encrypted at rest? Yes. How can you prove it? That button there. Okay, let's do some more security theater. Cool. And that's what this feels like. It feels like theater.
What are your thoughts, Warren? Do you agree?
Yeah.
Coming out from a different angle?
No, I actually came from the same position that John was at initially. I was really wondering what was going on here. I think you sort of nailed the nail on the head, though, because we are living in the age of insurance-driven security and compliance-driven security, and I think that's really where this is going. And I think at the bottom of the article, it does talk about it. So it's not just encryption of the state machine, but also maybe some of the inputs that are coming. As far as I could tell, that Step Functions didn't really offer any sort of encryption out of the box initially. But if you look at the article, it makes it really seem like they focus on customer managed keys more than anything. So you could, of course, use a built-in KMS key from Amazon to encrypt everything you got here. But at the bottom of the article, it really starts to talk about maybe you do really fall into that compliance category. Maybe if you're doing PCI DSS for payments processing and you've got some secret sauce there in the configuration, your auditor will definitely come and say, hey, in order to be compliant, all your data, however it's saved, needs to be there. I think this was a huge problem for SQS earlier on, where the payloads being sent to the service weren't being secured. My concern always is this isn't the right place to store data. You shouldn't be treating SQS or the step function as a database. You likely will integrate with DynamoDB or RDS or whatever you're using. And I think that's sort of where this comes from. With the huge change recently with step functions, a lot of push to getting the step function SDKs up and running, so you could just basically have all the logic in your step function. I think people started realizing they have database related data that is now being saved and passed between states rather than being in a persistent data store.
So what sort of data are we talking about here that we would be encrypting?
I mean, in theory, anything. In theory, it could be anything, because one of the there's a limit, there's a character limit, and there's ways around that. But a lot of what you do with a step function, certainly if you look at the one that we process this podcast through, is you have a Lambda that's filtering some inputs and then passing them downstream so that the next thing can use them more easily. If you use things like the native integrations for DynamoDB or whatever, then you can get data directly out of and into DynamoDB with a step functions call. You don't have to pass it through Lambda to do that. So in theory, it could be anything.
So is it potentially to encrypt PII so that even the developers of the function can't see the data?
Well, it's still going to be turnkey. So if you have access to look at the function, you're going to be able to see it, presumably, unless it's really tightly defined.
Well, so if you don't have access to the KMS key that's actually encrypting the step function, you'll be able to see it in the console and the configuration, but you won't actually be able to see the flow. You won't be able to see the activities, the data from the input and the outputs that are being returned. So this goes to a situation where I think you have a massive AWS account with hundreds or thousands of engineers who are using that same account, and you want fine-grained control over who can see the data that's being used within the step function that's now exposed because you have access there. So maybe you have regulations on your database and you're securing it according to whatever regulations you're following, but now it's coming out of that database and living in a second tool, which I don't think anyone would think about step functions as a database, so they may not be securing it. And I think this helps to give those auditors some peace of mind that only the right people are getting access. But again, I think if you're in this situation, you've probably designed this in a non-optimal way. I haven't been a fan of the native integrations with step functions because I think they're just incredibly expensive to go and do it that way, where spinning up a Lambda is honestly much cheaper and better to just interact, and you get free item potency there. I did a calculation a couple of years ago. If you have millions and millions of invocations and step functions, it can cost you up to, $90,000 a month or a year, depending on your scale. And SQS, for the exact same sort of thing, if you have no weight steps and it's just this thing and then this thing and then this thing, it's about 1% the cost of step functions. So it really gives you some insight here into
it
do you really
depends
want
on
these?
what it depends on what you're orchestrating. That's
Yeah.
a tool for the job, and I don't think that's an entirely fair comparison, because if it's just a chain of events, probably don't use a step function, because just chain your lambda through queues, because that's the logical thing to do. If you have the need for looping or something like that goes beyond the lambda 15-minute timeout,
For sure.
or you're iterating through different inputs, or you've got large amounts of complex parallel processing, then chaining things using an event-driven workflow, it's doable, but it's a lot less easy to understand. Because yes, you can still do that all with Event Bridge and direct lambda calls and kind of all the rest of it, but you're going to go a bit mad trying to debug it.
It's interesting you brought up Event Bridge, because Step Functions and SUS are two of the only services that handle retries into Lambda when there's a code execution failure. So if you've got Event Bridge hooked up directly to Lambda, you have a reliability
you
problem.
need a DLQ or something. You need to be able to handle
no. Actually, Event Bridge will send the message to Lambda to execute. And if you throw an exception in your Lambda, Event Bridge will not retry. Same with S3 bucket events as well. You need to be putting those directly in SQS or a step function in order to retry execution on Lambda when that fails.
I'm sure there's a way of doing it with a Lambda target or an on fail or something like that. You might have to do it manually.
The async execution for Lambdas is a 3-step retry where it just hands it off to the service. And if the code starts up and starts running and it's your code now being executed, there will not be any retries.
Interesting.
Well, we digress. So back to the main topic of the encrypted state machines.
Yeah.
And to try and answer your question, John, about why, I guess somebody asked for it somewhere. Somebody must have asked for it. Probably an auditor, like you said. But on that note, let's move on to our second article for this week, which this one is on the AWS Cloud Operations and Migrations blog, and it's all about introducing parameter store cross-account sharing. So, Warren, I'm going to come to you first on this one. What are your thoughts on this article?
I think I was just as befuddled as this one, as John was for the last one. I feel like if you've got cross-account configuration, you may be doing something in a suboptimal way that sharing it in this way makes a lot of sense. And I think there's a secret security aspect here, how we're actually sharing data across. The interesting thing is that because a lot of the services at AWS are microservices, they each have their own sharing mechanism, whether or not the attribute-based access control works, or IAM resource-based or resource-based, whether it's identity-based, are all different. I think this is just another one of those problems where data may need to be shared across AWS accounts. That's sort of a generic thing that AWS has to deal with, but the way that they've designed the account system in IAM is not really works well with that. It's actually interesting because it's something that we've had to design into our product to allow multiple of our customer accounts to sort of share permissions or delegate to another one. And I feel like when that comes to AWS, there's usually some sort of mess there when it comes to IAM permission sharing. So you could always get from one AWS account to another one by using a assume role from the first account into the second account and then getting access to the parameter store. But this creates a new type of resource called a sharing resource, which allows direct access without doing an IAM role exchange. John?
Yeah, I've never been a fan of resource share. I don't like the way that's been set up. And historically, yes, there's a reason for centralizing things like secrets and whatever, be that in Parameter Store or Secrets Manager, because one of the sort of quote supported unquote workflow patterns is if you have a whole bunch of org units that are all production and they all need access to the same things, you put that in kind of one place and then they all access the same thing. Fine. But yeah, this, I don't know. I've always just sort of hopped in, grabbed it, hopped back out again because it was just easier. And that's how you did it before this was a thing. This isn't a case of hopping in, grabbing it, hopping out, or setting up proper cross-account permissions, because cross-account IAM is awful. I think, honestly, it feels it's bad by design because that way there's a nice hard boundary between accounts and it's hard to do it by mistake because it's hard to do it on purpose. But this feels like they've seen that problem and gone, let's solve it by doing completely the wrong thing.
Yeah, it's what I like to call a pit of failure, right? You make the thing that you shouldn't be doing easier to do, and so people are more likely to do it rather than think about twice. Like it's a really big pet peeve of mine for sharing secrets between services, let alone AWS accounts. Like that just seems like a recipe for someone to jump into that account and share that secret with another account that likely shouldn't have access. Whereas if you have to go through the IAM path, you're more probably thinking about security in that way. You're realizing that there's a security implication. And if you're sharing secrets, it means it's very difficult to follow the audit trail of whatever that secret is being used to access, because now any AWS account could potentially have that access to that secret. Maybe someone typed in the wrong account ID and someone, just looping over through every single AWS account until they find that parameter that they now have access to.
Yeah, typically it's a shared secret. I mean, yeah, I'm of the same sort of mind, but I've always found it for sort of third party things where like an external mail provider or whatever,
Yeah.
as an example, where you only get one access key because they're just silly like that. And like I want to use this external mail provider or this external database or whatever from multiple different accounts because they have their own resources in them, or they all need to send emails or whatever. But I'm only allowed to have one set of credentials for it because that's what the SaaS provider has given me, and that's it. And that's this is my least bad option, is I put the creds in one place so I have a single break glass to rotate those if I need to. But it just feels wrong.
I'm snickering a little bit about that because in those situations, I found companies to be way more successful in their architecture if they have a point of contact with that third-party provider who's limiting them and only provides the credentials for two reasons. One, it's the audit trail of who's actually accessing that, because there's only one credential, then chances are your provider is not really focused on security. They don't really pay attention to that credential. The second one is if you have a bad actor, and let's not attribute to malice what can be easily ascribed to negligence. One AWS account is grabbing that secret and hosing your third-party provider, mail sender, et cetera. All of you are going to get blocked, even if there's a legitimate source there. So again, it's a good reminder that if you feel like you need to do this and you have a secret there, challenge that third-party provider. And I know anyone who's probably listening to your podcast says, that's above my pay grade. I don't get to make that decision.
Well, that's interesting because
it's a thing.
Yeah, it's interesting because it seems that what's simplifying things for operations, because this is on the AWS Cloud Operations and Migrations blog, is potentially causing problems for security. So maybe we should ask the authors of the AWS security blog if they have a reaction to this post, because it's an interesting reaction I'm hearing from you guys. But anyway, on that note, let's move along to our next article for this week. And this one's from the AWS News blog, and it's all about AWS touting their multi-cloud capabilities. So this is a post by Jeff Barr last week, I think it was, entitled AWS and Multicloud, Existing Capabilities and Continued Enhancements. And it's going over a whole bunch of tools that AWS have either launched or have always had available, which pieced together can help with a multi-cloud proposition. So, Jon, I'll come to you first on this one. I know perhaps not so relevant for us at Logicata because we're not really multi-cloud. We're pretty much AWS, all in on AWS. But yeah, thoughts on the multi-cloud toolkit available from AWS?
It's a bit of an about face from a few years ago, and that's not an uncommon position to this, because I've seen that particular comment on this and other articles over the last kind of week or so about this, because it's not all that long ago. And I mean, I'm kind of still of that mindset that AWS was no other clouds exist, use us. And then, Microsoft and Google, let's wash my mouth out with soap, came out with some somewhat better offerings and started eating some of their market share. And Google have done a number of other things with multi-cloud, Anthos being the one that comes to mind. So you can run, Kubernetes workloads everywhere if you want to using Anthos, which is okay, fine. So it's just very interesting about face, because they've gone from no other clouds exist to every other cloud is rubbish to, okay, so everyone actually uses multiple cloud providers anyway. Let's just play nice with them now.
Warren, your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm not sure how internal driven it is. I totally buy the few years ago, there really isn't another cloud, so there's nothing to talk about. Now, there also really isn't another cloud, so there's not really a lot to talk about. But we know that customers are using it. Customers are trying to make this work, whether or not it's the right thing or not. And I think this article, this blog post, is a chance to up the SEO marketing game so that you see that AWS has these tools, that they've always had them, always the capability there. I think part of the challenge is that AWS, the innovative thing was getting startups to market much faster without having to build their own data center, transitioning from capital expenditures to operational expenditures. And over time, in the last 10 years, you've seen a huge shift towards the enterprise market. And in enterprise market, we know that they have multiple business units within the same organization, same company, that are focused in different areas. They for sure will be using, unfortunately, one of them is using Azure, one of them is using GCP, et cetera, in the same organization. And now there's some business critical reason where they need to communicate effectively. And you don't want to hear that your primary cloud provider says, oh no, there's not really a good way of doing that. Even though why would you ever want to do that? It doesn't really matter. Someone is doing it, and AWS is definitely trying to capitalize on the whatever money is available from in the enterprise market.
Yeah, that's absolutely nail on the head, I think, because AWS was always go for the developers, startups, get in there, go early, go quick. Because when you've got no money, CapEx versus OpEx is irrelevant, because it's just, here's the pot of money I have to spend. If I can spend less of it and more slowly, brilliant. Whereas the enterprises were always, oh, here's my CapEx budget, here's my OpEx budget. It's all funny money anyway, because it's all the same actual money. But we've got this allocated to CapEx, so we're going to spend it on kit, even though you could spend less or spend it slower or whatever. But that's a different pot of money.
I love the you can transfer your data out of AWS to another cloud for free now. Like they're just repeating that. I'm just like, who are you talking to? Honestly, like as if the monetary cost of moving the data out of the cloud was the reason no one was doing it. Like for sure not. Like maybe
they only did that because Microsoft did it first.
And then I can't remember what the order was. Was it Google, then Microsoft, then AWS? AWS definitely wasn't the first to make that.
I think AWS was second. I forget which one came first, but AWS was second.
Yeah, it's interesting that I think it brings us to the point of, is what the cloud offerings of the primary three, is it just a commodity now? Or, are we all the way to utility really? And of course, then they all have to provide the same thing, whatever it is, and they all have to interoperate. You get your electricity from wind or solar, but also it doesn't matter what the provider is. If we think about it like that, then whatever the feature is that someone else comes out with, all the other ones have to do it as well. And so there is a question of whether or not that's just what's happening here, and it's not a differentiator.
I don't think we're there yet, but I think we're close. Because if you look at, in my world is serverless and then old-fashioned compute for, that's what my day job is. All of them do serverless to a greater or lesser extent. All of them do old-fashioned compute.
I guess the question is, which cloud is going to manage the multi-cloud? Because that's what I'm seeing in this article. There's a lot of tools here, which we could use this tool to manage your other clouds. You could use that. And, like you said, all the cloud providers have these tools as well. But ideally, for things like Secrets Manager, for example, or your observability platform, they're pushing CloudWatch here. Ideally, if, regardless of whether you're using one cloud or several clouds, you want to keep all of that information in the one place. And I guess a lot of these enterprises are using third-party tools for that at the moment.
ServiceNow usually.
Yeah, ServiceNow or Datadog or whatever the platform might be. And I guess there's a little bit of a pitch to say, hey guys, you realize that we you're probably using us for EC2 and RDS, but you realize we have these other things too, which could be, centralizing all of that data, and then AWS can be the cloud to manage your multi-cloud environment.
I think they really got there quite early on, actually, because they had to deal with customers saying, we have our own customer who's saying we can't use AWS, and not to name any names, some other competitor to Amazon. And, what do they do there? And I think the solution was workload execution in a different cloud where the main control plane can still live in AWS. So anything that helps enable that, I think, is still going to be, for sure, stick all your control planes in AWS and then only manage the workloads. But sometimes that means you may have to configure other tools in these other accounts in order to actually make it work out of the box.
Are you multi-cloud at Authorus?
So by definition, no, but we do use some GCP tools because the corresponding one in AWS doesn't really work.
It's GA4, isn't it?
It's I am not a fan of Looker whatsoever, but BigQuery plus Looker is infinitely cheaper, and I say infinitely, literally there, than the time stream databases that are available in AWS for managing it. And what we really want is just cheap metrics, storage, low volume of metrics. And if you use custom metrics in AWS, wow, that's really ambitious because the pricing for custom metrics is astronomical. And so we built our own data custom metrics management and in GCP. So we funnel those metrics out of AWS to do that.
Well, there we go. It's not the first time we've heard stories like that from AWS customers, and I'm sure it won't be the last.
Yeah.
Anyway, on that note, let's move along to our next article for this week. This one is on dev class, and the title of the article is AWS Quietly Freezes CodeCommit, Cloud9, SimpleDB, and more customers complain about, and more, customers complain about lack of notice. So there's been a huge amount of noise in this about this in the press last week of AWS doing something that they generally are pretty good at not doing. I think it's normally Microsoft and Google that we expect to do these things, but a whole bunch of services have been quietly deprecated, and Amazon have been quite heavily criticized by the community about the lack of comms around some of these service deprecations. And I'm going to come to you again first on this one, Jon, because I know that one of them in particular is causing you a little bit of pain at the moment.
Well, not right now, because it appears that we've got an exception in place. But yes, I am unreasonably annoyed about this. And I mean, I think my annoyance is reasonable, but from an outside, it's like, why are you getting so irritated about that? Because this has caused me a non-trivial amount of work for actual delivery for our customers, particularly for onboardings, which is, something that we do a reasonable amount of. And this is making my life quite difficult. Specifically, that's CodeCommit. I'll just rattle off the others because it's S3 Select. I didn't even know that existed. Cloud Search. No one uses that on purpose anymore because OpenSearch is a thing. Cloud9. I'm annoyed about that one, but just on a really kind of basis because that's used a lot in workshops and game days and those sorts of things because it's pre-vended. It's there. You don't have to worry about it. So that's a really. SimpleDB. Never used it. Forecast. Never used it. Data Pipeline. Okay, whatever. And then CodeCommit, I'm really angry about that one. Specifically, so CodeCommit, for the uninitiated, is AWS's Git offering, managed Git. It's fairly basic. If you compare it to something like GitHub, GitLab, it's nowhere near as good as them. It'll do merge requests, it'll do approvals on merge requests, and that's kind of about it. It does the other bits that those do. So GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, whatever, have their own pipelines, CI/CD, platforms and solutions. It does those through integrations with Code Pipeline, Code Build, Code Deploy. So those are other ways of doing that. So the Code Suite, as it's called, is more the whole tool, and it can do all of those things. But the Git offering itself is a little bit limiting. Fine. However, and we've often said this before when it's, well, why would you use the Code Suite tools? Much to our good friend and repeat guest Johannes's chagrin, why on earth would you use the Code Suite tools? They're rubbish. Because you need all of your data to stay inside AWS. You don't want to deal with the security team saying, well, code's coming from here and it's living over there and it's bouncing around and all the rest of it. And you don't want to have to do connections from external repos to get in, or you don't want to run external pipelines to then run things against AWS because that's messy and awkward. And if you don't know what you're doing, then OIDC is quite intimidating to some people. And this kind of solved for all of that. And what they've done is, one, they've killed it, which is just why? How expensive a service is it to? Okay, fine, it might need to make some money, but how expensive is it really to run a Git server? Like, it's not. It's just not. And two, I've lost my other thought because I'm so angry about this.
Well, Warren, have any of these affected you?
So I think the general sentiment on the internet has been, I can't believe that they botched the messaging. But, I sort of appreciate that because if you don't do something very often, you're not going to get it right. And AWS doesn't really deprecate services, which I think is
they deprecate Lambda runtimes all the damn time, and they do that really well.
So I think part of that has to do with the LTS support and security patches from the underlying runtime, and they're trying to keep up with what's there. And obviously they're doing it in an annoying way where they term it off. Like I'd prefer to pay more like the Kubernetes, lifetime support, where you just pay an extra $300 per month per control plane or whatever when you're using the old version. Yeah, but they didn't do that. I'm with you on the Lambda runtimes a bit. That really is annoying. So I've used CodeCommit myself, but only personally. I think if you needed a managed Git solution as part of your production workloads, then that could be the place to go. But from a user standpoint, it was quite a mess to be able to integrate it the way you want. Like as a developer, you would never really want to do that. The rest of the code
it's a pain in
tools,
the backside to get it to play nice with an IDE. I just
like
do that.
Like SSHing and whatever mechanism you want, whatever protocol, they just don't really work. You have to use like HTTP, but then you have to like somehow register your SSH credentials. But then of course you want to use your IAM role, which with SSO, and like that doesn't really work correctly. So
yeah, the only way I found to make it play nice, and it's because I'm a complete nerd, is auth the terminal, use the GRC connection, and then just do Git on the terminal. And that's okay for me because I know how to do that. But
yeah, no, I'm with you. So I think it totally makes sense if you have a half-baked product and you're like, this was an experiment and we either need to kill it or turn it into a real thing because we can't leave it in the current state. And if we see as their approach towards enterprise customers becoming more and more important, then having products that aren't, I'm just going to guess. I have no idea. Someone can call me out on this. I bet it's not FedRAMP High compliant. I don't even, who knows? Maybe it's not even, ISO compliant, for whatever the latest one is. And I could imagine that because, that's a state thing like Cloud9. It was a purchase, right? They acquired a company to get that IDE. Who knows what the state of that code was? Maybe they really realized they couldn't fix it. The one that really surprised me, I hadn't heard of most of these services. So I'm like, I don't care, whatever. SimpleDB, right? That's been it's still not in the console. Is that really gone? That's really going away? No more SimpleDBs? I'm sure there's someone out there who was like, I'm not going to transfer to DynamoDB. I'm using this thing. I don't use the console, whatever, totally good. This was sort of like the secret. You had to be in at Amazon at the beginning to even know about it because there's no documentation. It's not on the console. You just have to know how it works. Good job, Amazon.
So yeah, and I'm not even sure that they've done a good job of handling the bad press. It seems to be mostly Jeff Barr on Twitter that's been communicating most of these things. So yeah,
it's not called that anymore. He's on X.
Sorry, X. Yeah, I'm showing my age now. Yeah, though I still call it Twitter. Wow. Yeah.
I mean, I don't use anything that there aren't real humans floating around on. So I don't know what's been said there or not. But I think that here's an example of what would you want them to say? Yeah, I mean, they could have come out. They could have said, we're going to plan on deprecating these things. I think turning off, to be fair, all they've done was turn off on new AWS accounts access to these services, which I think is pretty fair. And honestly, I'm still waiting for the date.
It's not. It's fundamentally not, because I have a specific use case that this affects. So it's fundamentally not right, because what basically happened was the way this was discovered was someone had created a new account within an organization, had used CodeCommit in other places in the organization, tried to create a CodeCommit repo in the new account within the organization, perfectly reasonable thing to do, gets a message saying that you can't do that, puts a repost thing up, and then they reply on repost, AWS reply on repost saying, yeah, we're not doing that anymore. What?
I think at the org level, it makes sense for the determination for there to be rather than at the account level, or at least be able to be configured at the org level of whether or not access. I'm still waiting for the day that AWS terminates S3 private website, public websites. That should just be killed a long time ago. No one ever anywhere ever needs to make their S3 bucket public. There's actually 2 reasons why you may need to do it, and I assure you, you're not doing it.
Neither of them are good.
Well, unfortunately, you can blame Partner Central for the first one. If you're listing a product, your logo image needs to be in a public S3 bucket that can be loaded from there. Why? I don't know, but that's the one. And the other one is if you're hosting CloudFormation templates and they're in an S3 bucket, then that bucket has to be public. But unless you're doing one of those 2 things, you have no reason to use S3, having a public S3 bucket or using the public website now that CloudFront exists and everyone has to be using TLS.
Fair enough. On that note, I am conscious of time, and we do have one more article that I'd just like to touch on before we wrap up this episode. So last week was, of course, results announcement week for all the big tech companies, including Amazon. And Amazon has exceeded analyst expectations by 0.2 billion, I think, revenue-wise. And, of course, the earnings call was dominated by the performance of AWS. So much so, I saw a great article on the Register today that said something about, they were talking all about AWS. And, oh, by the way, we also have this retail thing over here, which Amazon.com. Great to see that the growth is back in Amazon. Warren, what are your thoughts on this?
I've been saying this for a while. I would have loved to invest in AWS as soon as they drop that fulfillment part. I think it should be spun out as a separate company, separate, stock ticker. It would, just eliminate all of that, because the return on investment for AWS is just magnitudes higher than what's happening at fulfillment. Even though the actual sheer revenue for the fulfillment side is incredibly high, it's just a huge cost. Obviously. And I think if you've used Amazon in the last few years, like a lot of tech products out there, it hasn't gotten better. I think it's interesting whether or not I think everyone wants you to talk about this. Is AI having an impact on that number? And I'm just going to be the first to say, no.
Not yet.
But
not yet.
Yeah, it's probably having an impact on the cost with all the massive investment that's going into building out data centers and GPU equipped servers, etc. But I can't imagine it's having much of an impact on the profitability right now.
Well, they did a genius thing of buying shares in a prolific AI firm, Anthropic, right? And so that's going to propel Amazon umbrella forward, whether or not AWS actually capitalizes on that integration or not.
John, thoughts on this?
I picked it because I know you like a big number.
I do like big numbers, and it is still a big number, and it's 19% growth in the second quarter, so exceeding analyst estimates. So it's all great, and very happy for Mr. Garman to be getting those results in his first quarter's tenure. I think it is his first quarter, right? This will be the first.
I don't know if it's been the first full quarter he's been in, though. I don't know exactly when he would have started.
I think it'll be the first results that he will have presided over anyway, in terms of the earnings call and that kind of thing. So I bet he's relieved.
So there is some research in the United States about the economic cycles as they correspond to like presidential candidates and who's actually running the office. And I don't know if this applies here, but there is definitely like a large window of what's been running, the ball's already going downhill. How many more quarters will it be before we actually see that impact? And I feel like maybe this service deprecation is really the first thing that we see. Is this going to have a positive impact on the business and usability and bringing more developers in, market share, et cetera? Or is it going in a different direction?
Yeah, interesting, actually. I wonder whether, Mr. Garman himself was behind some of those service deprecations. Are we seeing, some of the impact of a change of leadership here? Well,
his sales, he came up through sales, and maybe he's under the misguided opinion that things need to earn money.
There is I think if you spend any time in sales, and I have not, but I have talked to a lot of salespeople, there is something known as a loss leader. And just to give you an example,
in the UK, baked beans.
Just for anyone who's listening who's not familiar with this, it's like, when GCP sold their custom domain registrations, the hosted zones to another company, that's what we call a mistake, because it loses money to run that product. But if you can't put every time you build a new service and get a DNS for it in the same cloud provider, then you're running at a loss, but it keeps everything simple. And I think that's what we're seeing here. Like, it is possible that one of these products was really something that organizations that pay AWS lots of money care about using. I don't know which one it is, though.
Well, time will tell. But on the subject of time, we have used all of the time available to us for this week's episode. So only remains for me to thank you, John, as always, for your insights today. And thank you, Warren, for agreeing to come on and be our guest. It's been great to meet you and to hear your insights around serverless security and AWS in general. So thank you very much for joining us. That was season 3, episode 30 of Logicast. If you enjoyed it, tell your friends. We are available to download from wherever you download your podcasts. And if you'd like to see the funny faces we pull while we're recording, we also put our recordings on YouTube. So we'll be back. Well, we won't be back next week with another episode because John is going on holiday and I'm going to work from another country for a couple of weeks. So I won't have all of my equipment with me. But we will be back later in the summer with further episodes of Logicast for you. I think we'll be back in about 2 or 3 weeks. So thanks again for listening.